Good morning and welcome to the first panel in a three-part webinar series on solar trends for the real estate industry. This panel is called Maximizing Property Values Through On-Site Solar. And we've got three great panelists who will help guide us through that topic this morning. A couple of housekeeping items. Everyone is muted and their videos are blank, but you can submit questions as we go through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have time at the end to those. So feel free to type in questions as we go on that. So my name is Alexis Saba. I'm an associate at the environmental and energy law firm Sive, Paget and Rizal, and we'll be moderating this crew. I'm joined by my colleague, Mark Reisler, who is a partner at Sive Paget. He has over 30 years of experience representing clients in a variety of finance and M&A transactions, particularly in the renewables sector. I'm also joined by David Gall, who's the Senior Director of State Affairs in the Northeast for the Solar Energy Industries Association. David works on regulatory and legislative matters throughout the Northeast and was deeply involved in New York's Reforming the Energy Vision effort. And last but not least, the brains behind this webinar series is Rob Crowderoff, the CEO of Crowderoff Solar. Rob has more than a decade of experience advancing clean energy projects in New York City and beyond. So that's our team. The basic structure is that each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. David will start off the program with the regulatory landscape for solar in New York State, and then Rob will discuss some of the new New York City laws affecting solar and discuss deal structures that make solar pencil out. And finally, Mark will conclude with a discussion of financing opportunities and tax incentives. So we look forward to a good discussion with you all. And again, feel free to include your questions in the Q&A at the end. So let me share my screen and we can get going with David.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thanks, Alexis. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group today. Again, Dave Gall, Senior Director for State Affairs for the Solar Energy Industries Association. And so what I'm going to try to walk you through today is just some of the key policies that are driving the solar market in the state from the regulatory level. And then Rob and Mark are also going to touch on aspects of New York City policy, and then even how the federal tax incentives also help us support this market. So next slide. There we go. Okay, so let me just start with a couple of words about SEIA. So the Solar Energy Industries Association is the National Trade Association for Solar. And in 2019, we established a goal to have the solar industry provide 20% of the US electricity mix by the year 2030. We put out a report called the Solar Plus Decade. And the idea here is that solar, largely combined with storage, will help us reach this goal. And the document, the Solar Plus Decade, basically has 4 pillars to help us execute this plan. Capitalize on these market accelerators like storage, collaborating closely with partner organizations, pursuing policy drivers and opening new markets for solar, and then managing the growth of the solar industry responsible. Those are sort of the 4 pieces of SEIA's vision for the Solar Plus Decade. Next slide, please, Alexis. All right, so I thought it was worth starting with the policy foundation that really is sort of driving a lot of these investments in solar. And if you look at the box on the left here, and this box basically encapsulates New York's nation-leading climate targets. What we're trying to do is get 85% reduction, an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, 100% carbon-free electricity by the year 2040, 70% of our electricity should come from renewable energy sources by 2030. We're looking, the state has established a goal of obtaining 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030 and 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025. So these are aggressive goals, and they're all underpinned by legislation and administrative activity and rulemakings to achieve those goals. So in 2019, the legislature and the governor enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. This is a landmark piece of legislation that established many of these goals and codified them actually in law. And then following up on that in 2020, as part of this year's state budget, the legislature and the governor agreed on the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. And this is another piece of legislation that helps streamline the siting of larger scale solar projects. And then the last thing I'll say is that many of the pieces that we're going to talk about today were actually already in motion as part of the Reforming the Energy Vision effort that was led by the governor's team, including Richard Kaufman, Audrey Ziebelman, John Rhodes. They all put many of these regulatory pieces in place that have provided the foundation for the solar market in the state. And we're going to go through those, some of the key pieces there one by one. Next slide, please, Alexis. All right, so here's one of the first key pieces. This is one of the foundations of the distributed solar market in the state, New York Sun program. So New York Sun is an incentive program for solar, for both residential solar and for commercial and industrial solar. This is focused on the distributed solar space. So NYSERDA established what's called a declining block incentive program to incentivize the installations of solar across the state. These incentives are made on a first come, first served basis. The program is broken out by region. So there's specific incentives for the downstate New York City area. There are other incentives for upstate and for Long Island, although the Long Island program is largely closed at this point. The program is also broken out by sector. So there's specific incentives for the residential sector and non-residential and commercial sectors as well. And these incentives are paid to participating contractors on a $1 per watt basis. The program was initially authorized in 2014. The Public Service Commission made roughly $1 billion available to the New York Sun program. And then in May of this year, the Public Service Commission reauthorized or added another $600 million to the New York Sun program to help the state achieve that 6 gigawatt solar installation goal. So it's kind of noteworthy to see that the initial program was about $1 billion in incentive money to reach 3 gigawatts of solar. And then to reach 6 gigawatts of solar, the state was only allocated approximately $600 million. Just shows the declining costs of solar. It shows the component prices have gone down considerably, and there's less incentive dollar that's needed to make these projects economic. So I wanted to point that out. Quickly on the right here, just on the right-hand side, this is just a snapshot from the dashboard that shows you how the declining block incentive program works. There are tranches of capacity at particular incentive levels, and this is a screenshot, but you can go on NYSERDA's website and find out kind of where you stand in the incentive program at any given time. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the incentive portions. And now we're getting to the compensation portion. And so whenever we're talking about energy compensation for solar projects, you have to start with net metering. Net metering is a statute in New York. It's been on the books since the 90s. It is a foundational policy that helped drive the growth of the solar market. And it's been updated recently because of activities over at the Public Service Commission. We've kind of moved beyond the stage of solar being an early adopter technology. It's much more widespread. We've seen significant growth in the solar market. And as that growth has continued, regulators began to get somewhat concerned about the potential costs that are being placed on non-participating customers, on non-DER customers. And so the Public Service Commission recently updated the net metering framework in New York. And so net metering will continue kind of as is and through January 1st, 2022. But beyond that, if your project is installed after 2022, there are some new wrinkles. And so the changes basically involve establishing what's called a customer benefit charge. That's the fourth bullet on the slide there. It's a charge based on a dollar per kilowatt per month basis on the size of the solar system. And the idea here is that charge is supposed to help offset some of the contributions that solar customers probably would be making to New York's public benefit programs. The New York Public Service Commission authorized these changes in July of 2020. There are a lot of different rate options that a customer can choose from, and working with a firm to kind of understand what those options are is really important. And there's still some details to be resolved in the net metering framework in New York. The Commission didn't rule on a number of issues, for instance, whether the customer benefit charge would actually apply to customers that are on a time of use rate or something like that. But there have been some big changes to net metering in New York. That's kind of the key takeaway here. And starting in January 2022, the framework is going to look a little bit different going forward. Next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So that's kind of the compensation policy for smaller projects that are less than 750 kilowatts in size. For larger projects and for community solar and for larger on-site projects, most of those projects are going to be using what's called the Value of Distributed Energy Resources tariff, or VDER. This is a mechanism that was put in place by the Public Service Commission in 2017, I believe, and updated in 2019. And essentially what this does is it compensates exports for solar projects at a new rate. Once again, I think there were some concerns about whether just straight retail rate net metering credits were the right compensation framework for larger projects. And so the Commission established a much more granular approach to valuing what the export credit for a solar project would be. And so this slide is actually from the Public Service Commission. It sort of shows you on the left, the blue bars show you what how the previous retail rate credit was configured. And then the orange and sort of yellowish bars show you how the value stack actually works. And so at the bottom of the stack, you have the energy price, the locational price of energy across the state. And you have capacity that's set on top of that, an environmental value, and then an avoided distribution credit that makes up the total value of the credit. Ultimately, it's paid to the solar project. So there's some variations with in different options that you can choose within these buckets, but just as an illustration, you can kind of get a sense of how the value stack works to compensate these larger scale solar projects. And the Solar Energy Industries Association is going to be working to sort of improve some of these compensation components of the stack on a going forward basis. I spent a lot of my time working with our members trying to make this cost effective for many projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are the kind of the key features, right? The New York Sun program, net metering, the value stack for larger projects. But there are some other pieces that are important too. Storage has become an increasingly important part of the puzzle here. This graphic essentially shows that our expectation is that by 2025, more than 25% of all behind the meter solar systems will be paired with storage. New York State has a storage incentive program along with its solar incentive program. And so that these two technologies are going to be intertwined very closely for the foreseeable future here. So I wanted to mention that storage is going to be part of the equation and that there's efforts to support storage as well. But there are also other pieces. There's like a state tax credit that's involved here. There's the federal tax credits. There are other supportive policies that have helped create a strong solar market in New York State. And so let's move to the next slide, and I can just give you the projections about where we think this market is going. Okay, so this this slide shows you the historical install rates for the solar industry in New York State, and then from 2021 through 2024 shows you the forecast. It's divided up by market sector, so the blue bars represent, the dark blue represents the residential solar space, the yellow represents the non-residential space, and then the kind of aqua or light blue is the utility scale space, the really large projects. So you see utility scale is going to be a big part of the equation, and this kind of ties back to the some of those goals for getting 70% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. So that's going to be a big portion of the equation. But what I really wanted to point out was the dark blue and the yellow in these slides. What you're seeing here is the foundational pieces that have been put in place in New York have created a strong space and a strong market for residential, non-residential, commercial solar projects all over the state. And we're going to see steady demand for those kind of projects on a going forward basis. We still have very high utility rates in New York. And so all of these supportive state policies have created a framework to allow significant market growth for solar for the foreseeable future, and will help us ultimately reach that 20% solar goal for across the nation. So that's basically what I wanted to cover today. I'm happy to take some questions later on when we get to that portion of the program. And I'm going to flip it to Rob now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specific New York City pieces and his experience with helping to kind of site projects in the city itself. Rob?
Thank you, David. So as David said, I'm going to talk about some of the New York City-based laws and regulations, as well as different deal structures and ways to consider financing and developing projects on your property. Next slide. So a little background about us. We are based in New York City, work around New York State as well as New Jersey as consultants and developers working with property owners to help determine the best deal structure, walk through the development process, source contractors, provide design review, and construction administration. So really soup to nuts. We've been doing this a long time. There also is a very interesting law I'll talk about requiring solar or green roofs, and we have background in the landscape design world as well. So we're actually able to dovetail those two technologies when it's appropriate. Next slide. So the key drivers for solar in New York City in particular are both regulatory and economic. We've seen the passage of the Climate Mobilization Act in 2019 that has led to 3 local laws, Local Law 92, 94, 97 of 2019, which I'll talk about in a minute. Compliance around those laws are beginning to and going to continue to spur the growth of on-site renewables in the city. More largely, and this points to a lot of the growth over the course of the past decade David was referring to, is there are great returns available for solar, regardless of local law. And so I'll talk some about how deals can be structured. There are more and more opportunities to flexibly structure a deal on site based on the different needs as well as opportunities on a site-specific basis. Next slide. So to provide a high-level overview of a couple of the key laws, Local Law 92 and 94 is a building code requirement for solar and or a green roof on all new or substantially modified roofs. This law went into effect November 15, 2019. So any project that wants a permit from DOB must submit a plan for compliance with Local Law 92 or 94. There are some exceptions for certain types of affordable housing. There's an alternative, a 5-year alternative compliance period. Projects which wish to receive funding from the New York City Department of Housing and Preservation must submit a solar feasibility study and economic analysis. If a project is capable of delivering on returns in 10 years or less, then the solar will be required. So that's HPD's position on compliance with this law. There also is Local Law 97, a nation-leading carbon cap law, which sets limits on carbon emissions on a building-specific basis. Those limits vary based on building type. Buildings that are over 25,000 gross square feet must comply, with certain exceptions for affordable housing, although the exceptions for rent stabilized buildings have largely been removed. Alexis can speak more to this in the Q&A if folks wish to get into more depth on this. The penalty is $268 per ton on an annual basis for exceeding the carbon cap. This has direct implications of the value of solar to help comply with the law and reduce carbon emissions. And the first compliance period begins in 2024. The compliance requirements become more and more stringent over time. The subsequent period is in 2030. There is also an emission trading scheme that is in development and is expected to be a viable option for property owners. Solar is likely to be able to help property owners, especially those with portfolios of buildings, to help comply. So to get into the deal structures, there are three main types of deal structures for solar. The first being a cash out-of-pocket purchase, different ways to structure that. David spoke about net metering. It's also possible to connect what's called in front of the meter or directly into the grid. Thirdly, a project could be owned by a property owner and set up as a community solar project. Requires more administration, but the economic returns can be higher. Talk about what community solar is in a bit. There's a third-party financed and owned option, community solar on site. What this means is a solar developer comes in and they will own and operate the system, and then there are economic benefits that derive to the property owner as well as tenants of the building, or more largely of folks that live in the same utility zone. And lastly, there is an opportunity for those who are not able to receive solar on site for whatever myriad of reasons, can sign a subscription to receive essentially a share of a community solar project and receive a discount on their electric bills. So I'll talk about deal structures in each of these three areas. However, first, to get into a little bit more depth around the incentive landscape, because solar deals are largely driven by incentives. I'll go federal, state, and then local. Federally, there is an income tax credit, which was at 30%. This year it's worth 26% of the project. It goes down to 22% in 2021 and then 10% thereafter. Mark will talk about how to lock in that 26%, even if a project is not going to be built until next year or thereafter. Certain commitments made in 2020 can secure that 26% benefit. It is also possible to fully depreciate the solar asset in year one, or to use another accelerated depreciation schedule. So those two incentives combined, if an owner can efficiently use them, can cover somewhere around half of the cost of a solar system. David spoke about the NYSERDA New York Sun grant. It's worth adding that in addition to that base incentive, it's listed here as 40 cents per watt, which is the New York City going rate, at least as of when this slide was put together a month or two ago. There are certain adders for different types of projects, that it be on a brownfield or a canopy array, or the most lucrative adder is for affordable housing, which in New York City is structured to have a continued incentive at a $1 per watt level. So with a 40 cent per watt baseline grant, there's an additional 60 cent per watt bonus that is for projects on affordable housing up to a 200 kilowatt system. NYSERDA recently, and this is part of that broader package that David referred to that was passed earlier this year, there's an affordable solar and storage pre-development and technical assistance program. It's a mouthful. It is a grant that's able to help affordable housing owners and property owners, developers, community members that want to advance solar that impact low and moderate income households to get support to really kickstart a project. And it's up to $200,000 per application, so it can be a quite substantial sum of funding. Then if we look locally, there is the New York City property tax abatement, which in my eyes is quite remarkable. It was extended this year. It covers 20% of total project costs, net other grants. It can include re-roofing expenses. So for those of you who need a new roof, then it's a great opportunity to pair the new roof expenses along with the new solar system. As I said, it was renewed for a 3-year period. So there's a couple years to utilize this incentive, and they have made sure that battery storage technology can be utilized as well as solar in this round. Lastly, I spoke about the avoided cost of carbon, but that can be modeled out and seen as a long-term benefit for a project. That's not necessarily an incentive, but it does help a project to pencil when considering the long-term benefits of implementing solar on a building. Next slide. So a couple quick case studies. Here's a project. It's a cash purchase, 45 kilowatt system in the Bronx. This was connected in front of the meter. So we actually wanted to net meter or connect directly into the building's electrical, but their electrical system and wiring was very old. And we were concerned about triggering tens of thousands of dollars of improvements and headaches with DOB and Con Ed. So instead, we developed a strategy to connect in front of the meter directly into the grid. This used the value stack compensation structure that David ran through. And the compensation is a little bit less, maybe a penny, so maybe about 10 cents per kilowatt hour compensation rather than 11 cents, somewhere in that range. But the project still made economic sense for the property owner, able to efficiently utilize the tax credits and the depreciation, the New York Sun Grant Program, and the property tax abatement. Returns for solar projects frequently, with any efficient use of incentives, tend to range from 3 to 8 years. Folks always want to know before you even look at a project. And so just a general range in a large share of projects, if it's a 20, 30 kilowatt or larger system in New York, and sometimes even smaller projects can pencil out quite well. 17% in IRR for this project, 5-year payback period. The one other variable to call out is there can be substantial price differences among contractors. One of my favorite questions is what's the greatest, what's the reason that contractor pricing varies among bids? And it's not material, it's not labor. Those are in many ways that could be considered commodity. The availability contractors makes a very big difference in what a contractor has going on in their pipeline. And you can't know where they're going to come out necessarily until you bid a project out. So it's very important to consider multiple contractors when looking at a cash purchase project. Next slide. And now let's talk a little bit about community solar. Community solar is a project that is typically third-party financed and owned. This allows a project developer to take on all responsibilities and risk around project finance, procurement, development, and operations. The benefits to a property owner is that it is not necessary to spend any money. And then there are frequently multiple sources of economic benefit. Lease payments are given on an on-site project. The amount of those payments vary greatly by size of project and type of system. There are bill credits which are frequently allocated to the property owner. The standard going rate in New York and in the Northeast is 10% savings. And those savings also can be extended to tenants of the building or the community, or more largely, anybody within the utility district. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of allocating, essentially treating the community solar project as a pie of value, and then divvying up that pie where benefits are able to be derived by subscribers for around 10% off of the value of the bill credits. The other interesting thing in New York City is that the property tax abatement, which is up to $250,000 per site, so it's quite substantial, stays with the property even if a third party develops that system. So that's another way to really add a lot of value to a project, or capture value as an owner, and not have to be out of pocket. So there could be $50,000 or more a year of benefit for a project with substantial property tax liability for a large size system. So the slide here is showing some work that we are doing with a collaborating company, Oya Solar, to develop 1.3 megawatts of solar across 47 affordable housing sites. This is a little bit unique because we're aggregating a lot of small sites. Community solar typically focuses on some larger sites, but in this case, through an aggregation model, we're able to target especially the affordable housing sector to optimize a social and economic impact. We're working with a nonprofit right now, Services for the Underserved, as well as a for-profit, Lumley and Wolf companies, to develop 47 projects over the course of the next 12 months. So it's a very exciting initiative that we have underway. Construction will begin and conclude in the subsequent year. Next slide. To talk about subscriptions for a minute, for those who are not able to, who do not have a site that is viable for solar, especially it is possible to get a subscription in New York City. That is a very small share of the market. There are hundreds and hundreds, perhaps more, of megawatts of solar, community solar being developed in upstate New York. There's a great opportunity for property owners to subscribe to these projects and receive a fixed discount. So we've been working with Christopher Community. They're an affordable housing provider in upstate New York, to help them to subscribe to a couple community solar projects, in addition to work with municipalities and schools and others. So with Christopher Community, they looked at, and they're based up in the Syracuse region, to give you some geographic context. They looked at every deal structure. Do they own systems themselves? Do they try to attract a developer to do on-site third-party financing? And they ultimately decided through our work together to advance a subscription model across buildings that they both own and manage, due to the ease of transaction, the fact there's no capital costs, and the savings are guaranteed. So there's really not economic risk that is taken by the property owner for a community solar project. They're going to see more than $1 million of savings, 10% discount over a 25-year time frame. 37 buildings are in their building pool. They're subscribing. 2.6 megawatts of capacity, so substantial in size, and it's across a couple different utility zones in National Grid and ISA territories. Though our focus is in New York, I would be remiss to not mention that New Jersey also has a substantial community solar program, and we're helping the first projects that are going to go online in the next 30 to 60 days to subscribe, especially affordable housing and low income, more largely others as well, but really 50% of, it's a different approach than what we're seeing in New York. 50% of the project needs to be subscribed to affordable housing or low income residents. It is a municipal adjacent catchment area focus, so within the municipality where the project is located or otherwise. And there's a larger discount up to 15% for low and moderate income households. So there's some opportunity in our neighboring state as well. To conclude, there are many avenues available for generating value using energy on site. Regulatory compliance does present an opportunity for economic returns. So the new laws don't need to be a burden, but really are an opportunity for a lot of property owners to think more deeply about how to use on-site renewables. And it's worth considering the emerging third-party financing and ownership structures in addition to whether an owner wants to own and operate a system themselves. And at that, I will pass along to Mark, who will get more into the financing of projects.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for having me for this panel. As Alexis said earlier, I'm primarily a finance lawyer. I tend to represent lenders, but I also represent developers from time to time on project financings, and in particular project financings of renewable energy projects. And so today we're going to discuss largely third-party financing options relating to the development of solar and other energy efficiency projects. Next slide, Alex. So I'm going to talk about financing sources, but also talk a little bit about how property owners or developers can prepare for financing and some of the key considerations when looking for third-party financing of projects. Next slide. So in terms of financing, we're going to talk about four options. There are others, but I think these are the most pertinent for solar and for this audience. Cash, what's called cash equity, which is really simply cash investment in entities that develop projects. Tax equity, which is really another, essentially a cash investment in the development of projects, but where the value of tax incentives is factored into the return for the investor. Debt, if it's debt is essentially loans to a project, as opposed to equity, which is an actual cash investment and an ownership interest in a project. So debt is loans, and securitizations, which is basically just pooling of assets that throw off cash relating to the development of these projects. Next slide. So in terms of cash equity, there are a number of players. First of all, there is the sponsor or the developer. That's the entity that develops the project. They acquire the project site. And so a developer, if you're a property owner, you may work with a property, as a property owner with a developer. You may lease, for example, rooftop space on your site for the development of solar panels. The developer is largely going to be in charge of engaging the various professionals relating to the design, the development, the construction, the procurement of equipment relating to the project. And if you are a property owner that is simply providing a lease of space, it's a way to essentially not have to worry about all of the details relating to the development of a project. I mentioned also private equity. Increasingly, private equity is getting involved in the development of solar and other renewable projects. They are specifically seeing returns that are attractive, and so that may be on the larger scale side of the projects, but increasingly private equity is a player in the cash equity space, as well as the tax equity space. Next slide, please. Now, tax equity is kind of a complicated source of financing and level of in the structure of a third-party financing. Essentially, and I'm going to talk about the federal tax credit here, but largely, as I mentioned, tax equity is a means of investing by a party that has a tax appetite, largely has tax liability, that takes into account the value of federal, in this case, tax credits in determining the return on that investor's investment. And so the issue with the tax credits is that they are what they call non-refundable, which means that when you have a tax credit in the federal tax credit program, and in the case of solar, we're talking about the investment tax credit, the tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar credit against actual tax liability. So in order to take advantage of the tax credit, you have to owe taxes. And the tax credit is allocated based on largely the size of the investment in the project. So it's possible that a developer or a property owner that wants to develop a project can generate tax credits that are in excess of their tax liability. So, if you're developing, if you're developing a project and you have $1 million of tax credits and you only have, $250,000 of tax liability, then there's $750,000 of tax credits that would get wasted, and that's where tax equity investment comes in. Tax equity investment, in one way or another, takes advantage of tax rules that allow for the creation of partnerships and allows for the allocation of tax credits within those partnerships to entities that do have significant tax liability. And so tax equity investors are very often large financial institutions, large retail institutions that pay a lot of tax, that owe a lot of federal tax, and they will make an investment in a partnership, and in the context of that partnership, they're able to be allocated the tax credits, and they will pay for that, and that cash that is raised through that investment is then able to be used for the development costs relating to the project. So that's the essence of what tax equity is as a concept. Now, in the case of solar, as I said, we're talking about the investment tax credit in terms of federal tax credits. And as Rob already mentioned, that was a tax credit that started off at 30% of costs, and it's now scaling back over the next few years through down to currently for 2020, the tax credit is at 26% of costs, and it's scaling down to 10% of costs over the next few years. The determination of the tax credit rate that you get, in other words, whether you're going to qualify for the 26% now or a lower percent next year and the year after, is largely based on when the project commences construction. And under the tax code, that is determined in two ways. One is either physical commencement of construction. So if you commence construction, let's say, for example, in 2020, if you're able to commence construction in the short time left in 2020 to qualify for the 26% credit, if you commence physical construction, that's one way of qualifying for the commencement of construction test. But the other way of qualifying is essentially to incur 5% of the construction cost relating to the project in 2020 or in the year for which you're trying to lock in your credit rate. So that can include procuring equipment, for example. And so very often there's equipment orders placed early in the process in order to establish the commencement of construction as early as possible to take advantage of the highest possible ITC rate. The other component, and these are basically this is basically referred to as the safe harbor. In other words, what you have to demonstrate under the tax code in order to receive the expected rate based on the year in which you're commencing construction. And so the other component of this safe harbor is that once you commence construction, there's also the assumption that you are continuously working on the project, that you continue construction. And the way that's basically determined is that the project has to then be placed in service largely within 4 years from commencement of construction. There has been recently in order to accommodate the coronavirus pandemic and the halting of construction, construction suspensions during the time of the pandemic, and the delay in receiving equipment that was ordered during the time of the pandemic. There have been various essentially extensions that have been granted by the IRS to accommodate that, but that's largely the rubric of the safe harbor. As I mentioned, tax equity structures can be varied and can be complicated, but the common denominator is largely that in order to take advantage of the tax credits, you have to own the project. And so the rules around tax equity investments are largely rules that are dictated by the requirement that tax equity investors have to be true partners in projects that own the equipment, and that the most significant way in which the sort of true partnership is demonstrated is the long-term investment of the investor. And so in order to properly take advantage of those tax credits, the ownership of the investor and the ownership of the equipment has to extend for at least 5 years. And so there is this concept of a tax credit recapture period that is largely 5 years from when a project is actually placed into service. If for some reason the ownership or the investment by the tax equity investor is interrupted or suspended during that, what they call 5-year recapture period, then it's possible that an investor, tax credit investor, will lose those tax credits. And so the structures of all of those investments largely are driven by that and are largely designed to protect that recapture period. Next slide. And that's true about bringing in debt into a structure. So you could have a structure where there is a cash equity investor in the form of a developer, a tax equity investor in the form of a bank or a Walmart. That those are two ways of raising cash for the development of the project. And then another way is simply take out loans to deal with a debt provider. And when you have a tax equity component to a project, the most significant issue for debt providers is that you can't in any way interrupt the ownership interest of the project in the assets, because that affects the recapture, the tax recapture and recapture period. So for a period of 5 years from the date that the last component of the project is placed in service, debt providers have to address the issue that they can't necessarily foreclose on the assets in the project, because that could lead to a suspension or severance of ownership of those assets and a recapture of the tax credits. So that has to be structured in a way where the foreclosure, if there is a foreclosure on assets, that it's done in a way not to interfere with the recapture of tax credits. Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about securitizations. That's relevant, especially in the context of rooftop solar. Rob alluded to the fact that as a property owner, you may benefit in many ways from the development of rooftop solar, some of which don't have to do with actually consuming specifically the electricity that's generated from the projects. And so one way is simply to lease the space on your roof to a developer for use of, for development of a project on the roof. As Rob described, there is a benefit of receiving rent on the lease, and there can be tax abatements relating to permitting the use of rooftop for a solar lease. Those rooftop projects are often pooled by developers or by aggregators into a pool of assets that essentially throw off cash relating to the sale of electricity from those projects once they're aggregated. And that concept is largely referred to as securitization. It's the same concept that you see in the marketplace for home mortgages or credit cards. Same concept. There are a pool of projects. Those projects throw off cash. The concept is that if you have a larger pool of assets that throw off cash, then the risk is less than the risk of any single one of those projects. And so when they're pooled together, the reduction of risk means that there's an ability to raise capital at a lower cost. Next slide.
I'm just gonna jump in here just quickly, because we've got a couple minutes left, and we'd like to get to some questions. So I think it's important to talk about pace, because there's a lot going on with this, but hopefully a couple minutes on that, and then maybe we can get to a couple questions.
Yeah. So so PACE financing is largely a financing where the loan that is taken out is paid back by an assessment on the property. And it's a program. There are PACE financing programs all over the country. New York City is in the process of adopting it. And in October, the City Department of Finance published proposed rules for PACE financing for certain qualified improvements on properties, which can include development of solar on properties. Basically, PACE financings are repaid by an assessment on the property tax bill. It's collected by the City of New York. The PACE financings take priority over other mortgages or other loans on the property. So if you are a mortgagee, you actually are behind the repayment of PACE financing on your property. The only financing or the only payments that come ahead of PACE financing would be in New York State, various New York State taxes and assessments. And the key issue with PACE financing is that the financing basically runs with the property as opposed to the property owner. And so if a property is sold, the new property owner takes over the financing. The city of New York continues to collect on the financing through a charge on the property tax bill. And so that is going to be a program that I think is fairly long awaited in the city of New York. And there are going to be hearings coming up at the end of the month on these proposed rules. And the end of the comment period is December 2nd for these proposed rules. And hopefully they will be put in place fairly quickly after that. This slide has a list of some of the various types of improvements, including installation of renewable energy systems that qualify under PACE. And so we await further information regarding PACE in New York City after these proposed rules. And I think that's about it, Alexis. I think since we're running out of time, should we just go to Q&A now, or do you want to?
Yeah, we can go to Q&A. I was just having trouble finding the right button. So great, thanks so much, everyone. And if we don't get to questions, or you have other questions, certainly feel free to follow up after the program. We will send the slides and send the recording when we've got it. But we've got a question in now.
We have our first question. Please feel free to fill out questions. I know I can stay a couple minutes after the hour, and perhaps some of my colleagues can as well. The first question asking about providing more information on the history of the SUS and Lemley and Wolf community solar projects, how they originated, if there's resistance to the plans, are property owners becoming more knowledgeable? Yeah, there's an education period around the structure of community solar and how it works. I think we've been working in the affordable housing sector a long time, so that helped folks kind of knew us or knew of us. And the real benefit of community solar is it de-risks a project for a property owner, and that really helps get over concerns or barriers where there's not the ability for a property owner to either come up with the upfront cash or to efficiently utilize tax credits, or both. So in this case, the fact that they're not having to pay anything for the services, other than perhaps some of their own legal review and their time, makes it a much easier value proposition around being able to generate some income for their properties through a lease and discount on their electric bills. And it's mission-driven organizations, and they're very excited about helping to sign their tenants up so that they're able to benefit from the projects as well.
So if there's any other questions, we could probably take another one for the last couple of minutes here. But otherwise, we will follow up after the program with the presentation and the slides, and certainly feel free to email anyone here with follow-up questions. Really appreciate everyone jumping in today. It's very educational for me, at least. All right, well, thanks so much, all, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.